I spent a little time today trying to pinpoint where it first kind of hit my consciousness, and I would have to say it was kind of a twofold thing that happened around 1980. I think it was, upon the release of The River, and more specifically the River Tour. Now, I was too young for my parents to let me go to a concert, but all the kind of cool older kids that I knew from down at the beach, they were all going to see him. It was either at the Forum or the Sports Arena, and I remember giving them money to buy me a Bruce concert shirt because I thought that was something that I needed. So obviously I must have heard the music somewhere. So I remember specifically, and this will date me because people don't do this anymore apparently, or haven't in 30 years, but I remember hearing Born to Run. Now it was a few years late, but I remember hearing it on KLOS and just being so moved by the power of it that I had to tape it. And I had it on a cassette tape with Crazy Train from Ozzy Osbourne. I know those are two things that don't usually go together, but there was something about that I knew that, Bruce was something that smart people listened to, and that Born to Run really moved me. And I think that was happening concurrently with me probably being exposed to Hungry Heart. So I know that was his first top 10 single. So that was probably his first song, which would have actually come onto my radar actually on the radio.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Set Listing Bruce, your podcast all about Bruce Springsteen, his music, and mostly his fans. I am your host, Jesse Jackson, and I have another person that I've stalked on social media and said, please talk to me, please talk to me, please talk to me. So my new friend, Bryan, is on the show tonight. Bryan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Jesse. In full disclosure, you didn't stalk me that much.
Oh, that's very kind of you.
I was just playing hard to get, so it only seemed like you were more urgent than it was.
Oh, that's nice. So tell us a little about yourself, Bryan.
Well, my name is Bryan Behar. I'm a longtime TV sitcom writer. I've been doing that for the past 26 years. I'm beginning a pivot into professorhood. I've been teaching for the past year down at Chapman University, teaching writing, and I am a lifelong Los Angelino and Californian, and a longtime Bruce fan, though perhaps not necessarily in the same ways that a lot of people are. But I'm very excited to get to talk all things Springsteen related. And, hopefully I redeem myself. I've been studying up as much as I can today, so I don't sound like a complete rube, but I'll do the best I can.
Well, I don't think you can sound bad, though. I warned you that as we get closer, I may have to ask for Terry Polo stories, because I have had a crush on her since Sports Night. And one of the sitcoms you worked on, she was one of the lead actresses.
She was. I was one of the writers on I'm With Her.
Yes.
I think that was the 2000. I want to say that was the 2004 season. And like I said, I've been doing this for 26 seasons. And I've been on 21 shows. So, and I don't even mean that as a humble brag, but it is hard to remember what came what year. But Terry Polo, I understand perfectly having a crush on. She was delightful. Beautiful, both beautiful and funny, and a lot of you may know her as Ben Stiller's girlfriend, fiance, maybe even I think wife in the Meet the Parents series. But we were lucky enough to get her on a TV show even after she had done the first Meet the Parents. So it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, she was Rebecca on Sports Night, and then she played Jimmy Smith's wife on 2 seasons of West Wing.
Yes,
Yeah,
she did.
She was really good in that role too. Just really playing the right amount of kind of frustrated that she's thrown in this, role as a politician's wife, but also kind of really proud of him. So yeah, like I said, she's just one of my favorite people.
Well, it'd be very funny if I discovered that I was lured into a Terry Polo podcast under false pretenses
Yes, I
that I
know.
was going to talk about Springsteen. But no, but
Yes.
you're right. You just reminded me of the final 2 years of West Wing, in which Jimmy Smits ran against Alan Alda's Arnie Vinnick character for the presidency. It was like, oh wow, there was a time when Martin Sheen wasn't even the president. So I'm happy to talk about West Wing more than I'm happy to talk about my own career. So that
Yeah, I think I sometimes wonder, and we're going to get to music in a minute, but I know that sometimes musicians will look at other musicians and go, how the hell do they do that? I sometimes wonder if writers look at people like Aaron Sorkin and go, okay, deal with the devil, right? I mean, that's how this had to happen.
yeah, I mean, there are certain people who are just kind of blessed with, both an inordinate amount of talent and ambition and a voice all their own. I mean, like, what Aaron Sorkin does is a little different than maybe what I do, because my experience has almost entirely been in sitcoms. And, although he, while he did Sports Night,
Yeah.
he's probably more associated with writing witty dialogue, and banter in dramas, but there is no question I look at what he does in awe. I mean, I was in fact thinking about that today, it's funny you mentioned it, because I was thinking about Aaron Sorkin and about the opening sequence in Social Network, where he and I can't remember if it was Kate, I think it's Rooney Mara, are having this like really fast-paced but like inner I'm forgetting the word for the dialogue, but it's they're
Overlapping,
both
yes, back and forth.
overlapping dialogue. Yes, thank you. I'm getting older, and they they're both talking over each other and at a slightly different place in the conversation, and that's both such a hallmark of Aaron Sorkin and something that nobody else can do.
Yeah.
And I go back even as far as his original play, his original adaptation of his own play, A Few Good Men, which apparently he wrote like while bartending, and like he was, during his breaks, he would write snippets of like that, what is now like incredibly famous seminal dialogue on napkins,
Yeah.
as he was tending bar. But like that's a guy who came out of the gate. First thing he did was A Few Good Men.
Yeah.
So like I think that's like a pretty compelling argument that there are some people who just have a voice, have a style, and have been able to, have it come to fruition. And that's true whether you're writing movies, writing comedy, or writing music. I don't know, Bruce's, I know the story of him, signing to CBS and him doing,
Yeah.
a lot of the auditions, a lot of which, became, I think it was to John Hammond, who had been the A&R guy, who had also
Yes.
signed Bob Dylan. And a lot of the stuff eventually became, a sizable portion of Greetings from Asbury Park, and a lot of it only came out in album form this past year or past couple of years ago on Letters to You, where he sort of repurposed 3 of the songs from that era, including I think one of the songs from the original audition. But
Yeah.
I don't know a ton, but I've watched a lot of the documentaries and I read Bruce's autobiography, and and certainly he had to put in the years, in New Jersey bar bands to get to that point where he was getting his first break. But like much like Aaron Sorkin, one could certainly argue that he came out with a voice fully formed.
So, Bryan, and I promised listeners we're going to get to music, but you reminded me of a story that I think illustrates that really well. They were doing a documentary, some sports channel, and they showed John Elway's mother. And John Elway's mother says, "Oh, after the game, John would sit in the back seat and him and his dad would go over every play. They would talk about it, they break it down. And I think that's one of the reasons why John is such a gifted quarterback, is that his dad being a coach and everything just helped him do that. So they cut to Troy Aikman's mom, and she says, well, I think the reason Troy is such a really good quarterback is after the game, we would not talk football. It was forbidden in the car. We would always talk about something else. And I think that ability of staying away from the game and existing other features and having other things is the reason why he's so gifted. And the idea is, right, if you're a Hall of Fame quarterback, you're going to be a Hall of Fame quarterback, right? So if you have a voice, if you have a singular voice, it's going to show up somehow.
No, those are both fantastic examples because, they really are the polar opposite of each other. When you only gave me the Elway example, I was like, so that's it. That's the secret sauce. That's the key. He and his dad, who was a famous college coach at first at San Jose State and later at Stanford. Like, right. Wow, he's picking his dad's brain. There's the answer. And then you're telling me the story about Troy, who's another one of my all-time favorites, and It's the exact opposite. So like there's, in both of their cases, there is something obviously innate in them.
Yeah.
But their experience on how they got to their break and how they were able to sustain their success probably came from, pretty different places. I love that story.
Yeah.
And I love it especially because, I'm both a longtime UCLA football specifically, fanatic, because both of my parents went there, and as a kid who grew up in the San Fernando Valley and still lives there, John Elway was one of my first grade idols because I started following him when he was a quarterback when he was still in high school at Granada Hills High, and he was every bit the prodigy that we've come to associate him with, from his later success at Stanford and on the Denver Broncos. So, like Bruce, like Aaron Sorkin, like Troy Aikman, there are people who just come out seemingly destined for success. And then you look at Tom Brady, who, somehow slipped through the cracks at the combine and was not drafted until the 6th round. So, there's certainly a case for some people having a slower cooking and, kind of reaching their peak and fulfilling their potential at their own pace. So, hey, I didn't know we could talk about football on this.
I was going to say, Brian, okay, I have now fooled you twice. We are doing a Terry Polo, Troy Aikman, spotlight podcast.
This is fun. Wow, you're hitting all of my. We're going to talk about sitcoms and college football. This is fantastic.
Yeah.
I don't have to talk about music at all.
Yeah. So you said you grew up there in the California area, right? Actually, Los Angeles?
That's correct. Yes.
All right.
Sort of the suburbs of Los Angeles.
What kind of music did your family listen to? Talk to me about growing up, your origin stories.
So I was born in at the very end of 1965.
Okay.
So my very first musical memory, not that my parent, my dad was about 10 years older than my mom. So, he was a little old to be, sort of in the midst of the rock and roll revolution that was happening in the mid 60s. But all of my most vivid and happiest musical memories from from birth to 5, let's say, all involve the Beatles.
Mm-hmm.
I spent a lot of time going through my parents' vinyl, and a lot of it, admittedly, a lot of it was, Herb Alpert and Vicky Carr and scores to foreign movies. But of the things that appealed to me, I was able to find Meet the Beatles and Sgt. Pepper and the White Album, and then the original Monkees album and more of the Monkees. So the Beatles and the Monkees were really kind of the Rosetta Stone for my just being kind of obsessed with that pop narcotic.
Yes.
That's kind of the sound that was in my house. And even as I went, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, even in high school, when there was a kind of, a lot, so I'm going to high school in the 80s, and I'll talk a lot about sort of all the genres of rock that were kind of available to me, and specifically as someone who was growing up in LA. But even then, one of the things that appealed to me most, there was something called the Paisley Underground, which was kind of a repurposing of like 60s psychedelic sounds that had been popular, sort of mid 60s to late 60s by bands in the 80s. So I was going to a lot of those shows, and in turn rediscovering a lot of the sounds that I've often heard, both Bruce and Little Steven talk about as being incredibly formative in terms of developing their taste and their sound. Everything from the Byrds to the Dave Clark Five, to the Turtles, to Herman's Hermits, to Paul Revere and the Raiders, to Love and the Doors. I mean, so like that sort of mid 60s, 64 to 66 pop rock is sort of that's kind of like the foundational stone for all of my taste. And in many ways, it's probably not surprising that like a lot of like the Bruce melodies that I find most appealing are ones that kind of play off of that sound or echo that sound, or are sort of rooted in it, because I know that is a lot of the stuff that Bruce and the band grew up being most influenced by.
Yeah.
And you can hear, you hear it even when people are holding signs and he's playing, Double Shot of My Baby's Love by the Swinging Medallions, or any number of like mid 60s obscurities, Pretty Flamingo by Manfred Mann, so like a lot of his taste ends up being my taste, although he's probably about a half generation older than I am.
Yeah. So, Bryan, I have certain cliches, and if I meet someone from England, I immediately ask, "Oh, are you a Doctor Who fan?" If I ask someone who grew up in Jersey, I go, "Hey, are you a Bruce fan?" Right? So you're one of my first people that I've had that are native Los Angeles. Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys, where are they in your musical, fandom? Because that was my first musical obsession right out of high school. I graduated high school in 77. I picked up Endless Summers on an 8-track and had never heard anything like that before.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. No, I mean, there's no question that in many ways, like the Beach Boys, along with the Beatles, was probably amongst the more ubiquitous sounds that that you heard growing up. It's probably true anywhere in America.
Yeah.
But specifically in Southern California around that time, it was only probably in high school that I then, like during sort of my 60s revisionist phase,
Yeah.
that I know my brother gave me a cassette of Pet Sounds, and that, and then that turned me on to the whole cult of Brian Wilson, and, and just sort of, the majesty of his compositions. And that kind of opened the door like to a whole other level, beyond just what I might have known from an Endless Summer compilation.
Yeah.
Or or sort of their they're I was probably, like I said, more familiar with their 62 to 65 hits, and then once you start kind of like hearing the melancholia that and just the textures that come in Pet Sounds, whether it's God Only Knows, or Caroline No, or Sloop John B, or Wouldn't It Be Nice, and then obviously the stuff that that came sort of immediately after that, including the sort of failed, in quotes, you can't see me, but I'm making air quotes, failed Smile project, which he eventually put out later. But there's no question that that Brian Wilson obviously had a huge influence on my taste. And then similarly, I know that like that Brian Wilson, because and I was thinking about this just today, because both Brian Wilson and Paul McCartney both had their 80th birthdays in the past 2 days.
Right.
And I know that each was like a really prodigious influence on the other. That that Paul McCartney heard Pet Sounds and then wrote Here, There, and Everywhere, and then it was largely influential on the creation of Sgt. Pepper. and vice versa. I know that.
Yeah, like Brian has often said when he heard Rubber Soul, he's like, "Oh, I've got to work on this," which led to Pit Sounds, which led to Sergeant Pepper's, and it's like, yeah, I
That's
know,
exactly right. I mean, it's
yeah,
just it had to be such an exciting time. And I know that, both were, obviously influenced by Dylan at the same time, and that,
mhm.
Dylan's, folkier sounds clearly had an influence on Rubber Soul. Although, and this is so music nerd of me to say, but I'll say it anyway, what we think of the folk version of Rubber Soul is actually the American version that was not how the Beatles ever intended it, but was kind of a cobbled together version of some songs from Rubber Soul, but also songs from Help and Yesterday and Today that all, the record company Capitol USA found sort of the folkiest versions from the three albums and put it together in a way that the Beatles didn't like, but is arguably one of my favorite albums of all time, because it's
Yeah.
the one that opens with I just can't see your face. So, or I've just seen a face. Yes, I've just seen a face, and has It's Only Love, two songs that are not available on the more commonly heard British version of Rubber Soul.
So I know one of the, in fact, what one of your most recent gigs is working on Fuller House. Any chance you talk to Beach Boys with John Stamos? Because that would be, I'd be like, oh, forget all this other stuff. I want to talk about you hanging with Mike Love and Brian.
Well, I never met Brian, but
Okay.
I did meet Mike Love once, and I got my picture taken with him.
Nice.
So that was kind of a hoot, and you always know it's Mike Love because he's either always in a baseball hat that says the Beach Boys or says Mike Love. So
Yes.
there is no mistake. There is no mistaking him for anyone else. But I've never met Brian Wilson, but I know that he eats lunch at the same deli almost every day for the last 20 years. So if I desperately needed to find him, I would know where to look.
Yeah, I just watched Long Promised Road. I just recently watched a documentary, and my wife and I are going to see. He's coming to Dallas tomorrow. Chicago and Brian Wilson and Blondie Chaplin, Al Jardine are all touring together. So we're going to see Chicago and Brian Wilson's band tomorrow, and I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, ironically, that's one of the few bands I've never seen live. But as we talk more about Bruce, you might be surprised to discover there seems to be very little correlation between bands I love the most and how often I've seen the band.
Oh, how funny.
Because I would say, like, if someone were to like know me pretty well, they would say, "Oh, Beatles and Bruce are arguably Brian's two greatest loves and two greatest influences." And I've seen Paul McCartney once, and I've seen Bruce twice.
Oh, how funny.
Yeah.
If I put, who do you think you've seen the most perform, Brian?
And again, like, the correlation doesn't necessarily add up to who I am or what my tastes really are, but I've seen the Grateful Dead 20 times.
Okay.
And I've seen REM 11 times. Now, REM I would definitely have as a massive influence on me, and probably the band that most was like sort of representative of my exact generation. Like,
Sure.
that was a case of like, oh, that was our band, and we knew them before they were big and got to watch them, toil through the indie scene and then have massive popularity, and then we all got to have sort of success by proxy. The Dead I obviously love, and I love the experience of going, but like, if you were to meet me, I don't know that if you would be able to pick me out on a street as a Deadhead, because there's nothing about me that would necessarily indicate. But I just saw them again, Dead and Company, at Dodger Stadium a few weeks ago, so I was able to rack up my 20th show.
Very nice.
But I mean, I have, admittedly, many of those came in big chunk during college, because that was like definitely a thing to do in the 80s. I mean, not that it ever has died out, even with Jerry's passing. But I was able to see them a lot and see them a lot in sort of big chunks where, whereas most bands are able to see sort of once on a tour, if you're lucky, the Dead you can see 3 times in a weekend, by virtue of traveling. So I think that's where I got those numbers, but it still doesn't explain sort of my woeful lack of Springsteen numbers. So I hope you don't kick me off the pod.
No. Well,
but like even I'm surprised. I'm like, wait, I guess it has only been twice, and only since I've been an adult. And I think a lot of my Bruce experiences and memories are sort of tied in more with things that I've experienced as a grown man and as a husband and a father than they did necessarily during kind of more formative teen, high school, college years, which I know is probably not the norm. But knowing that I would be speaking to you today, I had to give like a lot of honest thought to when I picked him up, what he meant to me at different times, and in turn, what else I was probably listening to at those moments that might have precluded me from like sort of being more fully committed to Springsteen fandom and why. So those are some interesting soul searching that you've forced me into.
I am glad.
I'm not sure you'll like the answers.
No. In fact, what's interesting, Bryan, is I usually ask the question, and I preface this way. I go, the amount of times you've seen Bruce perform live is not a fair barometer of how big of a fan you are. I think a lot of that has to do with age, your location, your economic situation, and circumstances. There are people that are, found him in the early 70s that live in the East Coast that have seen him over 100 times. There's other people that I've had two, both in their early teens, like barely breaking 20, one of them, and the other one 19, that this last Broadway show was the first time they had ever seen him. And they are massive fans. So I just think you can get into that kind of bragging, right? Like, well, if you can count how many you've seen, you're not a real fan. And
sure.
It depends. It depends on the circumstances.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you both saying that and delineating a lot of the reasons, both geographic and emotional maturity and socioeconomic, that all sort of factor into it. And I think you're 100% correct, because, I don't consider my fandom to be any less than anyone else. And I don't think the connection that I feel to both, he as an artist and a person and to the music is necessarily any less emotional or meaningful than anyone else's. It just it's sort of the age I was when it connected to me, combined with geography, I think had a lot to do with it. And just sort of in reference to what you were talking about, those kind of early 70s Bruce heads from the tri-state area, like I both am a little too young for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think being a Bruce fan on the West Coast was a lot more of a niche experience. It was more of a choice.
Right.
Than to be like, you hear about like those kind of Jersey, Long Island, Bruce fans, who see him 50 times at the Meadowlands or in Nassau County or MSG, and they see Bruce and they see Billy Joel and that's it. And like that was never going to be my experience. And I think that's not a bad thing. I think in large part, growing up in California, and I don't mean to suggest that growing up, on the East Coast and being a Bruce fan in that way is parochial or provincial, but like my experience was different in that in the early formative period that you were talking about, like, in 75, I'm still listening to Casey Kasem and AM radio. And, I think by 78, at the time of Darkness, I'm not even aware that Darkness exists because I'm still 12 years old. So I'm listening to, disco and the Grease soundtrack
Oh,
and
absolutely,
you
Brian.
know, and get the knack. So
Yeah.
I'm not, you know, I was aware that there was this guy Bruce Springsteen who had been on the cover of Time and Newsweek simultaneously in 1975, and I knew that Bruce Springsteen was something that smart people listened to, and it was often like discussed as like, oh, college kids really like Bruce Springsteen. So it was always kind of out there in my mind as something that was aspirational. But you know, that back then, like I had very little money to spend on records, and I was sort of limited to what we listened to in, you know, in my parents' car. So I was listening to top 40 radio, and I was, you know, I think the first record I bought was Wings Over America, and then I got Steve Miller Band's greatest hits. But I was not at 10 years old and then 13 years old. I wasn't the market to go out and buy Born to Run or Darkness on the Edge of Town when they came out on vinyl.
Well, so yeah, I'll I'll make you. I don't think I need to make you feel better, but I'll empathize with you. So I
Sure.
graduated high school in 77. I'm in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Moss
Yes.
Bluff is the suburb of Lake Charles where I'm going to high school, Sam Houston High School. And I remember going to a barber shop, and there was either Time or Newsweek. I don't remember which one, but and it's whichever one that says, world's number one rock star or whatever.
Sure.
And I'm looking at this going, who is this guy? Have they never heard of Elton John? Have they
Yeah.
never
No.
heard,
I mean,
have they never heard of Queen? How about Barry Manilow? Or like,
no.
who
Those
is
were
this?
those were the
Right?
biggies. I mean, it
Yeah.
was. I mean, it was in 1975. It was impossible for anyone. I mean, maybe Led Zeppelin on the hard rock, sort of stadium attendance level, but in terms of pop 40 dominance, there was nobody who compared with Elton John. And in fact, I don't know that there had been since the Beatles at their heyday. So it was really not uncommon, and in fact, very common for someone in my age in 1974, 1975, up through, Philadelphia Freedom and Don't Go Breaking My Heart, and even Island Girl, for Elton John to be really kind of the main pop influence, in addition to my kind of rediscovering the Beatles and using my own money to buy the red and the blue albums, which were essentially their two greatest hits divided by eras. But those were like albums that I was able to sort of buy independent of my parents and begin like, a further deep dive into Beatles melodies and the whole mythology. So yes, definitely Beatles / Wings, Elton John, and like you're right on about Queen, because they, I remember around 76 Bohemian Rhapsody being like, I would tell people, oh, that's my favorite song. So I think you are dead on in terms of what the average kid was listening to versus, John Landau and other critics of the era.
Well, and I had the AM radio. I had a clock radio next to my bed. That's what I listened to music on. So you talk about a great sound system, right? It's just this little AM
Absolutely.
clock radio.
That's what I had.
And
Yeah, I was listening to 93 KHJ,
yeah,
Los Angeles.
and I believe 1580 KLOU. I'd have to look that up, but I know it's KLOU. And Brian, the FM station, that's what the druggies listen to, right? I mean, that
Yeah, no, that was too scary.
yeah. And also I remember telling, I think I want to say it's Caroline. It was Caroline or Karen. Someone, I was in my homeroom or one in my class, and I said, I don't listen to FM because I don't know the songs, so you can't sing along. And they looked at me like, yeah, that's the point. And I
Right,
was like, no, the whole point of a
like
radio.
it sounds like you had a similar ear and a
Yes.
similar fear of FM radio that I did. I mean, like I bet there were kids in my class who had older siblings or who were smoking pot in the fourth grade, because I did have those. It was the Valley in the 70s.
Sure.
and those kids were listening to Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple and Grand Funk Railroad
Yes.
and just obviously like harder, heavier stuff. And obviously like we eventually as a teenager, I made that transition over to the FM dial, and I went from KHJ to any of your listeners in the Southern California area would know KLOS or KMET, and then more specifically K-Rock, which is sort of the Cinca known when it comes to American modern rock station. So those were how my ears were being formed. Obviously, went through a transition as I made the leap from AM to FM.
I'm curious to hear you talked about your transition and discovering Bruce. When did you kind of become a quote unquote Bruce fan, and what about his music spoke to you, Bryan?
Yeah, no, I mean, I spent a little time today trying to pinpoint where it first kind of hit my consciousness. And I would have to say it was kind of a twofold thing that happened around 1980. I think it was, upon the release of The River, and more specifically the River Tour. Now, I was too young for my parents to let me go to a concert. But all the kind of cool older kids that I knew from down at the beach, they were all going to see him. It was either at the Forum or the Sports Arena. And I remember giving them money to buy me a Bruce concert shirt because I thought that was something that I needed. So obviously I must have heard the music somewhere. So I remember specifically, and this will date me because people don't do this anymore apparently, or haven't in 30 years. But I remember hearing Born to Run. Now it was a few years late, but I remember hearing it on KLOS and just being so moved by the power of it that I had to tape it. And I had it on a cassette tape with Crazy Train from Ozzy Osbourne. I know those are two things that don't usually go together, but there was something about that I knew that, Bruce was something that smart people listened to, and that Born to Run really moved me. And I think that was happening concurrently with me probably being exposed to Hungry Heart. So I know that was his first top 10 single. So that was probably his first song, which would have actually come onto my radar actually on the radio. So it was a combination of people I thought were interesting and smart, and in a few cases very pretty, all had declared themselves Bruce fans. So I wanted to be part of that, coupled with rediscovering things like Born to Run in concert, in conjunction with hearing some of the new stuff like Hungry Heart. Now I don't remember whether and I think it's quite possible the guy who drove me to school, because we had older kids drive me to school. There's a very good chance that he also had The River on cassette, because The River remains my favorite Bruce album. I don't know if I think it's the best. That might be Darkness in my mind, but as far as giving me just pure enjoyment and most listens, it's definitely been The River.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I was hooked. But I will say that with the caveat that in Southern California in the early 80s, there were a couple things happening that weren't Bruce. No, on the one hand, you had the rise of, what they called modern rock radio, as exemplified by K-Rock. And all these bands, everything from the Clash to the Police to the Go-Go's and X and the Blasters, a lot of whom were local, who you could see at any time, and that extended to bands like ska bands like the English Beat and Madness, or punk bands like Black Flag and the Minutemen and the Dead Kennedys and Agent Orange. So there was just a lot that we were being exposed to here in LA by virtue of it being like, that in New York is sort of being the home of where you were going to get the most exposure to British bands, to a lot of the bands that came out of the second British invasion, whether it's synth bands like Duran Duran and Human League. Devo was huge, where, amongst my friends, as were the Cars, as were the B-52. So these were, kind of mind-blowing new sounds. And on the flip side of that, you had the more traditional AOR kind of hard rock sounds that you would hear on like KLOS. And that was like your Van Halens and your Led Zeppelins. But there was no question that growing up in the Valley and Rush, those were the bands that the people who were riding dirt bikes and skateboarding and had longer hair than I did. So that's who they were listening to.
Mhm.
So there was not, at least amongst my peers, that kind of Bruce mania that you might associate with a New Jersey upbringing.
Sure.
We had
Absolutely.
one kid in our group who we all made fun of, and now we all will look back like, wow, he was way ahead of this curve. He was a guy who came from Newcastle, England, and came to our middle school in 8th grade, and for some reason he was obsessed with Springs at the exclusion of everything else. And I remember he wouldn't listen to the Go-Go's, and he wouldn't listen to Van Halen, and he made fun. He's like, you'll see, the test of time is going to prove me correct. And he was right.
That is great. That is so funny.
Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned you'd gone to a couple of shows. What shows did you go to?
So both have been pretty recent.
Okay.
And again, like, I don't know why I didn't go when I had the opportunity. Obviously, this is the long way of answering. Obviously, when Born in the USA came out, Bruce became not just a ubiquitous rock figure, but a ubiquitous pop figure, like, sort of along the lines of Prince, Michael Jackson, and Madonna. It's kind of hard to explain to younger people who only know him as kind of this elder statesman of rock and kind of the epitome of dad rock, that he was once the biggest pop star in the world.
Right.
So then, once he got that big, he was obviously way more on my radar. I owned that cassette. I knew all the videos. I loved Bruce, and I did think he was one of the good guys. He was like our good guy who broke big, but like, I was still probably more attached to early REM, because I went to Brown University, which, was a little on the esoteric side and on the new wave side. So like, we were listening to early REM and early U2 and Talking Heads and Violent Femmes. So I'm sure there were people there who got really into Bruce and saw him 10 times at the Meadowlands or 4 times at the LA Coliseum. But for some, I think he was too big then. He had become too main. Like, I missed him when he was on the way up, and I missed him when he was too mainstream. So long story short, and I'll jump ahead, as an adult, while Bruce has always had like a place in my heart, I feel like it kind of connected more emotionally with me with a handful of things as a grown-up, one of which was the suicide of my father, who took his life in 2008. And for whatever reason, the only thing that was able to soothe me musically was Bruce. And
is there something specifically, one song, or?
God, I'm not thinking of one song.
Okay.
But interestingly, in my mind, as you get older, you start to associate things that may not even been connected. But I know that Tim Russert, who was a giant Bruce fan, the NBC News correspondent, he died the same year. And I remember that Bruce played it, like an acoustic version of Thunder Road at his funeral.
I remember that.
And I remember, just not that I was close to Tim Russert, but I think because I was so exposed and vulnerable emotionally from losing my own father, that like somehow that all was connected in my mind. And I went through like a very deep Bruce phase in which I like downloaded, I think, 2,000 Bruce songs to my iTunes. And a lot of the kind of the more melancholy stuff are the things that have had kind of more appeal to me as I've been a dad, as I've lost a dad, whether, like you mentioned, the Bruce on Broadway. Well, if you were to like put a gun to my head, and I would rather you didn't, but I would probably say Tougher Than the Rest is my favorite Bruce song.
Right.
But specifically the one he does with Patty, in addition to Brilliant Disguise on the Broadway shows. And I don't know why I had surgery that week that it came on Netflix, and I ended up watching that concert 4 times in the hospital. Now maybe it was the the opioids that they gave me, but like those 2 songs both soothed me at a time when I was in a great deal of pain, and have remained like incredibly soothing. And it's not to say that I didn't love the originals, but there was something about like the added meaning that he imbued it with age, and tying it in with his his love of Patty that just I found incredibly impactful. Like other examples, I'll give you an example that's really personal. One of the two times that I saw him, the first time was at Dodger Stadium. I'm trying to, I want to say that was maybe a tour associated with the Magic album.
Yeah.
Um, and then I saw him again at the sports arena indoors when he was touring his revival of The River. And like I said, I've heard The River thousands of times, the album, but like the song Stolen Car somehow had eluded me.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember hearing it almost as if for the first time that night. And I was there with my wife, and we had not been going through great times. And there was something about the lyrics about this couple that had fallen in love when they were very young and then had drifted apart that so resonated with me that like on the ride home, I had a kind of a come to Jesus talk with my wife. Now we've been together for 31 years. We've been friends for 38 years. I mean, we met in high school. We go all the way back, and it's the love of my life. And like we had this talk in large part that was triggered by that song, in which was like the talk was one of, do we want to make this work or has it run its course? And it led to a lot of really difficult discussions. But we've never been better than we are now. And I think a lot of it has to do with sort of the emotions that were engendered by that song and that moment at that concert. So it's just really interesting to me how like even a Bruce song that I wouldn't have ever said was on my radar or was one of my favorites had such a kind of a profound impact on my life and on my emotional trajectory.
Two things. One, a writer named Sarah Goodman wrote her first novel was kind of a Bruce themed novel, Beyond the Palace, and it's a love story where a couple, they meet and they follow a Bruce tour, and stuff happens because it's a romance novel, right? That it's not
Sure.
smooth sailing. But she talked about that she was never a Bruce fan, but her grandmother died, and her father was a big Bruce fan, and she picked up a mixtape that he had made for her, and she stumbled on Atlantic City, and the lyrics, everything dies, baby, that's a fact, but maybe everything that dies someday comes back. With her missing her grandmother, she just played that song over and over again, over and over again. And that was the gateway to her becoming, and now then Sarah's this, massive fan. Land of Hope and Dreams and Better Days are my two songs of that. In 2015, I was diagnosed with colon cancer. I'm fine now, but I went through chemo and surgery, and I listened, and Better Days to me is a song that says, this is life, and you need to enjoy every moment of every day and not keep looking for better days, right? Too many people are waiting for their ship to come in and everything. And so those are, when people ask me what's your favorite songs, I always name those two, and then I said the third changes every day, but those two are solidly on it. So
yeah, no, I totally get it. I mean, I find Land of Hope and Dreams incredibly inspirational.
yeah.
I think I probably first came across it on that live in Madison Square Garden disc that when he reformed the band in 99 2000. I was thinking of what my favorite songs are. I was gonna, and what I much like you, it's hard to pin down just one. I was gonna say, if you're throwing me a birthday party, I want you to play No Surrender. If you're throwing me my funeral, I'd like to hear Tougher Than the Rest.
Yes.
If it's just every day, for some reason I'm really attached to Janie, Don't You Lose Heart, one of the B-side tracks from the Born in the USA sessions that I think I've discovered on the Tracks 4 CD set, and like I have no emotional connection to it. It just sounds. I think I love Bruce when he embraces his really poppy and his really romantic sides, and I don't mean poppy like Glory Days or Pink Cadillac, two songs that are not my favorite, but like poppy in the sense of really kind of feels like what the stuff that Bruce and I listened to back from the 60s.
Yeah.
Like probably three of my other favorite songs are all from the River, and they're all fast ones, which is a little uncharacteristic, because I usually like kind of the slow emotional ones. But Out on the Street, Sherry Darling, and The Ties That Bind, which I didn't really recognize it, but people have pointed out to me the opening guitar is almost identical to what you might hear on a Byrds album. And I was like,
Yes.
yes, it is. It's that sort of 12-string Roger McGuinn style guitar. So it's probably not super uncommon or inexplicable that a lot of my favorite Bruce stuff are the ones that are most influenced by that kind of same British invasion sound and that same 60s pop sound, that I was first hooked on, as a kid, as a Beatles fan, as a Monkees fan. And then again in high school when I was, the only guy in my high school who was obsessed with the Byrds and dressing like Roger McGuinn in turtlenecks and blazers. Don't ask, but I have the pictures. I can put them on Twitter. But
Bryan and I were having so much fun that we kept on talking. So come back tomorrow for the second half of our conversation, where we discuss more of his writing career, more of his music fandom, and he answers the Mary question, of course. Thanks. Doing a podcast at times can be a one-way conversation, and I hate that. So please let me know what you like and don't like about the work I'm doing. You can reach the podcast via email at setlistingbruce@gmail.com. The show is on Twitter at setlistingbruce, and my personal Twitter is at jessejacksondfw. You can support the podcast by subscribing via your favorite podcast player and leaving us a review. The more reviews we have, the easier it is for people to find us. And please tell a friend about the podcast, especially if they love Bruce or music, because it will make a difference.
You just heard the fun talking, hard rocking, music loving, album ranking, fan thinking, joy spreading, lyric reading, story sharing podcast that is the one, the only Settlers. The theme for Settlers was written by David Rosen, used by permission.